In 1324, the air in the markets of Cairo turned sour with panic. A bag of grain that cost a handful of coins yesterday now demanded a small fortune. Merchants shouted, their voices cracking as they shoveled gold dust and bars aside to reach for simple bread. The bedrock of the medieval economy was fracturing in real time. Everywhere, the streets were flooded with the metal, turning the currency into a burden rather than a reward. Prices spiraled upward, leaving the city in a state of unprecedented paralysis. How could one man, appearing suddenly from the vast, empty desert, possess enough wealth to dismantle the stability of an entire empire? The merchants watched the horizon, waiting for a face that would explain the madness. They had seen the caravans arrive, an endless line of carriers trailing gold like a wake behind a ship. The economy was hemorrhaging value, and the source of this golden tide remained a shadow. Somewhere in the shifting heat of the dunes, a ruler was moving toward them, carrying a secret that would rewrite the history of the world. Long before the markets of Cairo collapsed, the Mali Empire looked not to the dunes, but to the sea. King Abu Bakr stood on the western coast, staring into the infinite stretch of the Atlantic. He saw a frontier where others saw only an edge. He commanded 2 massive fleets to be built, their hulls timbered to withstand the deepest currents. The first fleet departed, sails catching the salt-heavy wind, and never returned. Silence followed. Months turned into years of waiting, but the king did not lose his resolve. He ordered a second, even larger fleet to be readied. This time, he would lead the voyage himself. He stepped onto the lead vessel, turning his back on the throne that had defined his life. The ships moved out from the shoreline, shrinking into mere specks against the gray horizon. They sailed directly into the rising mist and vanished. No wreckage drifted back to the shore. No messenger arrived with news. The king was gone, and the throne stood empty. A void of dread, the kingdom waits, scanning the waves for sails that would never break the horizon, left only with the silence of the sea. The void left by the missing king did not collapse the state. Instead, it provided the foundation for a new era. Into the silence of the court stepped Mansa Musa. He did not hesitate. He forged a realm, a unified force, tightening his grip on the trade routes that snaked across the desert. Caravans that once traveled in fear now moved under the protection of his soldiers. He built a network of outposts. Gold flowed to the capital, calculated motion. He mapped the production of the mines, reorganized the taxation of the merchants, and turned the empire into a titan of commerce. Prosperity flowed inward, filling the treasury and strengthening the borders. Under his discipline, realm bloomed, a trade heart, building markets that rivaled the greatest hubs of the age. By the time he solidified his hold on the throne, the empire was no longer just a kingdom. It was a beacon of wealth that commanded the attention of the world. Musa held the gold, but he did not believe it was meant to stay buried in the vaults of his capital. A grand pilgrimage to Mecca, a vast 4,000-mile journey. The preparation was a feat of logistics that dwarfed any state project before it. Thousands of attendants were recruited, scholars, soldiers, and servants, each with a specific role in the moving city. Hundreds of camels were brought in from the northern reaches, their endurance tested by the heavy loads they would bear. They were not carrying trade goods or salt. They were loaded with pure gold bars, stacked high and secured against the animals' flanks. The scale of the assembly was beyond comprehension. When the caravan finally coalesced at the gates, it spanned the horizon. The weight of the gold caused the camels to groan under the burden, and the lines of people stretched so far the end was lost in the dust. It was an intentional display of force, a declaration of wealth that turned the desert road into a path of gold. As the signal to depart sounded, the vast column surged forward, a living, breathing entity of silk, dust, and unimaginable treasure, moving with a rhythm that signaled the beginning of a legend. The desert did not respect the status of kings. Beyond the known frontiers, the Sahara opened like a furnace. The sun became a physical weight, pressing down on the caravan until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Every step kicked up blinding clouds of fine, parched sand that coated the lungs and stung the eyes. The camels, heavily laden with their golden burdens, slowed to a rhythmic, grinding crawl. Their breath came in ragged, wet heaves. Attendants fell silent, their gazes fixed firmly on the heels of the person ahead, eyes narrowed against the relentless glare. The horizon offered no variation, only an endless, shimmering expanse of dunes that seemed to mock their progress. Water supplies dwindled. The metal of the gold bars grew hot enough to blister skin, turning the very treasure they carried into a source of torment. The pace became a grueling test of will against the indifference of the landscape. Life's fragile thread, not silk and gold, golden void. The temperature climbed toward midday, and the silence of the desert deepened, punctuated only by the occasional, sharp crack of a dry wooden crate settling under the sun. The horizon finally broke. The endless, shifting dunes surrendered to the firm, cracked earth of the Nile Valley. The scouts returned at a gallop, their faces tight with the news. Cairo was within reach. The transformation was instantaneous. The exhaustion that had hollowed out the ranks vanished, replaced by a rigid, disciplined posture. Attendants straightened their frames and checked the bindings on the gold-laden camels. The caravan, previously a ragged line of survival, reformed into a procession of absolute authority. Dust settled, revealing the vibrant colors of the silks they carried, now catching the light in a sharp, metallic contrast against the brown desert floor. Ahead, the spires of the city rose above the haze like a mirage made solid. News of their approach had traveled faster than the camels. The desert air hummed with the proximity of a major center of trade. The local nomads watched from the ridges, their movements frozen as they witnessed the sheer scale of the arriving force. Musa rode at the head of the column, his gaze fixed on the approaching skyline. The world waited in a heavy, breathless silence. The wealthiest man in history was no longer a traveler in the wilderness. He was a force of nature about to collide with the heart of an empire. Musa entered the central market of Cairo, not as a guest, but as an elemental force. He began to distribute gold with an open hand, a gesture of piety that quickly spiraled into a relentless deluge. Coins flowed into the hands of the poor, the traders, and the beggars until the streets glittered with an unnatural, heavy density. At first, the merchants welcomed the influx, their stalls overflowing with buyers. Then, the logic of the market snapped. The sheer volume of gold circulating meant that gold itself had lost its status as a rare commodity. A loaf of bread that cost a single coin in the morning required a handful by noon. The currency was flooding every corner of the city, devalued by an impossible surplus that no one could contain. Merchants stood behind their counters, watching their ledgers become meaningless lines of ink. Prices for grain, oil, and spices skyrocketed as the value of the standard currency plummeted to nothing. The bedrock of their economy was dissolving under the weight of the man from the desert. Confusion turned to panic. Men scrambled to lock their doors, but the gold kept flowing, pouring through the cracks of the city until the entire financial structure of Cairo stood on the brink of total collapse. The panic did not fade with the sunset. As the caravan moved on, the market remained paralyzed, trapped in a deep, stagnant recession that would haunt the region for a decade. Merchants sat in empty shops, their scales idle, staring at piles of gold that had lost the power to buy necessities. The currency had been hollowed out. Trade routes that once hummed with activity fell silent, as the shockwave of the devaluation rippled outward to the shores of the Mediterranean. Word traveled faster than ships. In the ports of Venice and Genoa, the stories were whispered with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They spoke of the man from the deep desert who had broken the back of a thriving empire with nothing but his own generosity. The name of Mansa Musa was no longer just that of a king. It was synonymous with the destabilization of the known world. His arrival had been a spectacle, but his departure left a vacuum that defied recovery. The regional economy was shattered, its foundations eroded by the sheer, unquantifiable wealth that had passed through its streets. Historians would later look back at this moment as a turning point, where a single individual proved that even the mightiest financial structures were fragile against such an overwhelming tide of gold. The gold was a catalyst, but it was not the end. As Mansa Musa turned his back on the Mediterranean, his mission underwent a profound shift. He no longer sought to display wealth. He sought to import brilliance. He walked through the cities of the Islamic world, not as a buyer of goods, but as a recruiter of intellect. He approached architects, astronomers, and poets, offering them a new frontier in the heart of the Mali Empire. They agreed. The return caravan was no longer just a train of camels carrying bullion. It was a moving academy of the brightest minds of the age. Upon his arrival in Timbuktu, the transformation began in earnest. The labor shifted from the mines to the drafting tables. Foundations were laid for mosques and universities that would soon define the skyline. The city changed its pulse. Where once there was only the rhythm of trade, there emerged the scratching of pens on parchment and the debates of scholars in hushed, stone-walled chambers. He poured his resources into the creation of libraries, filling them with manuscripts that would preserve the collective knowledge of humanity. The gold had destabilized one empire, but it was now building a foundation for another. Timbuktu rose from the dust, not as a monument to profit, but as a bastion of enduring intellect. Centuries have ground the Mali Empire into the shifting sands. The mines that fed his treasury are quiet, and the markets that once trembled at his presence have long since evolved into new, unrecognizable forms. We measure our worth today in digital stocks and global data, looking back at the map of history to see his image still holding that golden orb. But the question of whether he would be the richest man in a modern stock exchange misses the foundation of his work. Empires inevitably crumble. Fortunes are liquidated, redistributed, and forgotten as quickly as they are minted. Gold is a finite resource, subject to the whims of inflation and the passage of time. Yet, look at the libraries he commissioned. Look at the manuscripts that survived the decay of stone and the heat of the sun. The culture he fostered, the schools of thought, the exchange of ideas, the preservation of human record remains. His true wealth was not found in the weight of the bars carried by his camels, but in the intellectual architecture he left behind. As the sun dips behind the Sahara, casting long, bruised shadows over the silent dunes, the image of his caravan fades into the golden horizon. It is a reminder that while coins pass from hand to hand, the knowledge we impart to the future is the only currency that does not devalue. Mansa Musa left a legacy that transcends the physical world. He built something that refused to fade,